This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Magic Spoon. Healthy cereal. It tastes too good to be true.
You might or might not be aware that some of the colonies that would eventually become states of the Union actually declared independence from Great Britain before the Continental Congress did, caught up in that anti British fervor. But one of those not only declared independence from Great Britain, but at the same time declared independence from Pennsylvania. It was all part of a long and tumultuous history that would result in the state that today we call Delaware. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
With Magic Spoon, I can enjoy one of my favorite treats from my childhood without all the sugar or all the guilt. It's a great way to get a dash of protein during the day. So use my link in the description or my code THG, and you can try Magic Spoon cereal or treats and get $5 off. You can also get Magic Spoon on Amazon or at your nearest grocery store. And they're so confident in the product that they have a 100% happiness guarantee online. So if you don't like the product for any reason, they will refund your money. No questions asked. So use the link in the description or the code magicspoon.com/THG or use the QR code and get $5 off.
Europeans first came to the land that would become the modern state of Delaware in 1624, when the Dutch East India Company established trading posts there. The English, however, claimed the land based on claims that John Cabot and others had explored the watershed as early as 1497. They named it after Thomas West, who was the third Baron, Delaware, who was governor of Virginia from 1610 to 1618. In addition to the Dutch, Swedish posts were also established in the area. In 1632, Cecil Calvert, second Baron Baltimore and proprietor of Maryland, made claims in the area, partially to contest the Dutch claims. The exact boundaries of the colony were somewhat vague, except that the northern boundary was the 40th parallel. In 1664, agents of James, the Duke of York, ousted the Dutch from the area, seizing the land for himself. Issues quickly arose, however. Baltimore claimed that he had been granted the land. York, who held charters to territory making up all of modern Maine, New York, and New Jersey, had an advantage in that he was the brother of the English king, Charles II. Calvert chose not to press his claim. James had no real claim on paper to the area, however. The territory the king had granted him in 1664 was from the St. Croix River, now part of the border between Maine and Canada, and all the mainland to the east side of the Delaware Bay. The three counties that make up Delaware sit across the bay on the western shore. That didn't stop him from claiming, however, occupying and administering the site. In 1681, William Penn was granted a charter for the colony of Pennsylvania, which specifically excluded the town of Newcastle, or lands within the 12 miles of it, defining the 12-mile circle, which is still the border between Pennsylvania and Delaware. Penn, however, wanted an outlet to the sea for his new colony and entered into what seems to have been a personal negotiation with the Duke of York to lease the land on the western side of Delaware Bay. On August 24, 1682, the Duke of York gave Penn a lease on the town of Newcastle in the 12-mile circle for 10,000 years, and the second lease for the same period of all the land south of the 12-mile circle down to Cape Henlopen. This region became known as the Lower Counties on the Delaware. Penn's lease effectively meant that he inherited the claim for the land from the Duke of York, but there remained the claim from Maryland, which would lead to a century of litigation between the heirs of William Penn and the Baron of Baltimore. Legally, Delaware never existed as a colony in its own right and had no royal charter. Officially, it had no name at all and was only called the Territories of Pennsylvania, or the three lower counties on the Delaware, though neither name was ever firmly established. It was always at least nominally governed from elsewhere, but there were issues with the scheme. As Richard Rodney, historian and Delaware State Supreme Court Justice, wrote in 1930, Penn's connection with Delaware soil was never a happy one. There seems to have been no period of even a few years' duration where political peace and concord uniformly prevailed. The three counties were annexed at the request of the 27 leading men of the three counties, possibly at the instigation of Penn himself in 1682. Penn established a frame of governance providing for an assembly with equal membership from each county. The assembly meeting place alternated between Philadelphia and Newcastle, but Penn seemed to underestimate the differences between the two possessions. By 1690, relations between the three lower counties and the rest of Pennsylvania were becoming strained. There were numerous differences between Pennsylvania and Delaware culturally, economically, and even religiously. Southern Delaware was in many ways more like the Chesapeake Bay colonies than Pennsylvania, and Delaware relied more heavily on tobacco and enslaved labor than Pennsylvania. While Penn sought to establish a Quaker colony, Delaware was comparatively cosmopolitan with more diverse settlers and religions. The battle over autonomy was constant. In 1690, the lower counties simply appointed their own judges when they disapproved of the judges appointed by the Colonial Council. In 1691, disagreement reared its head again, this time over how to govern the colony in Penn's absence. Pennsylvania chose to be governed by a deputy governor, but the lower counties protested that they preferred to be governed by 5 commissioners. They also stated they declined to have these things put to a vote because they felt that Pennsylvania legislators only consented to a vote if they knew they would win it. For at least some time, representatives from the lower counties refused to even attend assembly meetings. In 1700, a meeting of the assembly in Newcastle preceded a full break between the province of Pennsylvania and the annexed counties. The representatives of the lower counties proposed that the union of Delaware and Pennsylvania shall be confirmed on condition that no time hereafter the number of representatives in the province shall exceed that of the annexed counties, and that if Pennsylvania added more counties and thus more representatives, the union shall cease. 1701 would be the last joint session between the two parties. On October 10th, a bill was read that asked to reconfirm the acts passed in 1700, as some question had been raised as to the legality of the laws since they were passed outside the limits of the province itself. This was the last straw for the lower counties. If laws passed in Newcastle could not apply to the province, why would laws passed in Philadelphia apply in the lower counties? Many of the Delaware representatives left the assembly for a time, and finally a provision was made for separate assemblies in case the union split. Over the next few years, battle between Pennsylvania and the Delaware counties continued over representation. A separate assembly for the 3 lower counties finally met in November 1704, although it did little. The salient fact was that Pennsylvania and its annexed counties, though nominally under the same governor, became separated forever in their legislative functions. Though this politically separated the counties from Pennsylvania, there were other issues threatening its independence. Although the authorities in Maryland had chosen not to press their claims in 1664, by 1669 Lord Baltimore had changed his mind. In that year, a surveyor was sent to determine the proper bounds of Maryland and claimed that the whole western shore of the Delaware River, to a point well north of Newcastle, belonged to the Maryland colony. Maryland authorities sought to actually take control of the region in what is now southern Delaware, near Cape Henlopen. Commissioners from Maryland were forced to withdraw from the area when residents near the Cape rejected their claim. Maryland, however, continued to try and bring the area under their governance, creating Durham County, which covered most of modern Delaware. In 1672, the disagreement actually turned violent when Maryland surveyors were again forced out. A raiding party led by Thomas Jones invaded, with power to seize all Indian goods or skins. The raiders then forced them to take an oath of fidelity to Lord Baltimore. When Delaware authorities protested, Maryland insisted the whole region belonged to them. On July 30th, 1673, during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, a Dutch fleet captured New York. Lord Baltimore saw an opportunity to retake the land by force and sent Captain Thomas Howell on a mission to burn the town of Horkill, now Lewis, Delaware. The raiders, about 40 in all, came into the town with swords drawn. After occupying the place for 2 weeks, Howell brought the inhabitants together and told them that he had orders to burn the entire town to the ground, that he must not leave one stick standing. Howell left the settlers without guns or shelter save a single barn that failed to burn in December 1673. When the war ended, the Dutch returned the region to the English. Charles II regranted the region to his brother in June 1674 after the war ended, on the idea that the Dutch conquest might have voided the previous grant. After the territory was granted to Penn in 1682, Baron Baltimore, now Cecil's son, Charles Calvert, began selling land in the area, hoping to settle it with men loyal to himself and wrest control. Raids from Maryland, and likely in return as well, continued. Claim over Delaware was hardly certain. As late as 1676, the Duke of York's secretary bemoaned that the grant of Delaware was not very secure. In 1682, Baltimore again sent representatives to find the latitude of Newcastle and found that it fell well below the 40th parallel. In fact, Philadelphia lay below the 40th. Baltimore's reckoning was correct. Officials had granted Pennsylvania land north of the 40th parallel, but had wrongly assumed that the border would intersect with the already determined 12-mile circle around Newcastle. Lord Baltimore himself crossed the peninsula with a force of armed men, demanding that Pennsylvania's acting governor, William Markham, whose pen himself was out of the colony, meet him in Newcastle. Markham refused, forcing Baltimore to travel to him, where he demonstrated again the measurements of the 40th parallel. Baltimore then publicly claimed all of Delaware as well as the Chester area. Baltimore seemed more willing to press his claim against Penn than he was against the Duke of York. Penn and Baltimore met in December 1682, but the meeting was not fruitful. Penn insisted he needed the back door of Delaware as a port on the Chesapeake for his colony to be successful, and if his charter didn't grant him that, he wanted the charter altered. Baltimore merely insisted on honoring the 40th parallel boundary and built a fort near the parallel in western Newcastle County. Penn was just as determined to keep the land and wrote that as Delaware was necessary to my province, I endeavored to get it and have it, and I will keep it if I can. Like Baltimore, he offered land for cheap or with cheap rent and sent magistrates to arrest anyone cooperating with Maryland. The fort near Newcastle was occupied until at least 1687 and only abandoned when the small garrison got drunk one winter night and were found frostbitten in the snow the morning after. The debate then turned to England. Penn had been doing everything he could to support his claim. Penn paid for the legal cost of Charles II, officially granting the Delaware counties to the Duke of York in 1683, which the Duke had already leased to Penn 7 months earlier. Both Penn and Baltimore sailed for England, which delayed any action. It wasn't until 1685 that anything could be done, and by then Charles II had died, and his brother, the Duke of York, had become King James II. Penn felt he had an advantage thanks to his friendship with the king, but he also presented another key piece of information. When Baltimore had received the grant for Maryland, he had sworn that the region was only inhabited by non-Christian natives and uncultivated. Penn presented evidence that Dutch settlements already existed in the region when Baltimore received the grant. In October 1685, the Board of Trade instituted a boundary up the middle of the peninsula between the Delaware and the Chesapeake from a horizontal line beginning at Cape Henlopen, which then ran north to the 40th parallel. Everything west belonged to Lord Baltimore, while everything east belonged to James and, by extension, Penn. Probably all could have been solved there, but the situation deteriorated. James delayed making an official grant of the land to Penn and was finally chased out of England in the Glorious Revolution in 1688. While it didn't end the dispute, the Trade Board had definitively determined that Delaware did not fall under Maryland's original grant. In 1709, Baltimore petitioned Queen Anne to dismiss the parts of the ruling which gave Penn any right to the lands south of the 40th parallel, but Anne chose not to intervene. While this ended the official debate over the issue of borders, on the ground settlers continued to battle as sheriffs competed for jurisdiction and both governments made grants for land in Delaware. Charles Calvert died in 1715 and William Penn in 1718, but the dispute outlived them in their descendants. In 1722, the new Baron Baltimore complained that the Chief Justice of Maryland County was arrested by Pennsylvania authorities for running out some lines in the woods, and Maryland in turn arrested a Pennsylvania surveyor. Violence erupted in 1730 in what was called Creasap's War, named after a Maryland settler, Thomas Creasap. The conflict was the result of disputes over law enforcement and tax collection, among other things, near the Susquehanna River, well west of Delaware. Creasap's War would eventually lead to the deployment of militia by both colonies in 1737. Once again, the matter was sent to the king, who was now George II. Again, Maryland insisted on the 40th parallel as the border, while Pennsylvania argued for a border 20 miles south of Philadelphia. A compromise was made which largely maintained the previous ruling, but also adjusted Pennsylvania's border south. The map of the agreement, however, incorrectly placed the southern border of Delaware 19 miles south of Cape Henlopen. Surveyors gathered to mark the border, however, stalled out over the 12-mile circle around Newcastle. Maryland surveyors claimed that a circle needed a center, and no center had been determined. They also argued that the circle should have a circumference of 12 miles, while Pennsylvania surveyors wanted a radius of 12 miles. The matter was sent back to court, and George II issued a decree barring either from making grants in the disputed area. This culminated in a pair of Chancery Court cases. In 1745, in Penn v. Lord Baltimore, the court chose not to make a final order that would cover many of the same topics as the final decision in a second Penn v. Lord Baltimore decided in 1750. In relation specifically to the border, the Lord Chancellor, Philip York, Lord Hardwicke, determined that the 12-mile circle should be measured as a radius, but that it should be measured from the center of Newcastle, not its outskirts, and that the point 19 miles south of Henlopen should be used as the southern boundary. He later also ruled on several other smaller disagreements. But this actually didn't end the dispute, but surveys began to mark the boundaries. Frederick Calvert became 6th Lord Baltimore on his father's death and froze the agreement until finally acquiescing in 1760. To measure the 12-mile circle on the northern boundary of Maryland, the parties hired a pair of surveyors, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. The pair established a temporary star observatory, now known as Stargazer's Stone, and began their survey. In 1767, they presented their finalized boundaries. King George III finally approved it on January 11, 1769, more than 85 years since Penn was originally granted the Delaware counties. Of course, the situation in the American colonies had changed somewhat between 1682 and 1769, and as the colonies turned towards independence, Delaware continued to act on their own accord, and indeed had representatives at such important meetings as the Stamp Act Congress and the First and Second Continental Congresses. Thomas McKeon and Caesar Rodney, who served as delegates to all three Congresses, were the same two men who proposed that they simultaneously separate their counties from Pennsylvania and from England. On June 15, 1776, the Delaware Assembly passed the Act of Separation, which established the state of Delaware.
The Mason-Dixon line, of course, would go on to play a larger role in U.S. history, but its origin as an attempt to determine the boundaries of Delaware and its role in the creation of that state is today often forgotten. Delaware, of course, would go on to become the first state of the Union when it became the first state to ratify the U.S. Constitution on December 7th, 1787. And while it is the second smallest state in the Union by land area, it has a large history of a royal dispute that outlasted 8 monarchs before leaving Great Britain altogether and becoming a state of the Union. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.